with where you can have more or less chairs. You have to guess. We didn't guess well. There we go. I think we're close. There are some chairs in the front for those in the back, for the timid among you. And if there's odd spots in the middle, maybe we could squeeze a little bit. Or the undergraduates can sit on the floor. That's another option. All right, I think we're basically there. More chairs coming. Good evening. Welcome, one and all. I'm John Boyle. I'm professor of Catholic Studies and Theology here at the University of St. Thomas, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you to this evening's lecture by Dr. Elizabeth Lev. Before I introduce Dr. Lev, I want to acknowledge both Catholic Studies, the Center for Catholic Studies, the Department of Catholic Studies, and the Department of Art History, who have sponsored and made possible Dr. Lev's visit here to St. Thomas. You're not here to hear me, you're here to hear Dr. Lev, so I'm going to give you the short version of Dr. Lev's story. Here it is. She left her native United States to go and study art history in Italy, and she never came home. There's the short version. Is that basically right, Liz? Yeah, there we go, more or less, yeah. She did her doctorate at the University of Bologna and went to Rome, where she has been, I've learned, for some time. That's what we say. We try to figure out how long any of this has been, for some time. Dr. Lev, as many of you know, is one of the foremost guides and teachers to the art and architecture of the city of Rome. It is remarkable, and I see nods from those of you who have studied with Dr. Lev. You've forgotten how hard it was, and the pleasures are now the only thing left in your mind. Dr. Lev is an extraordinary teacher, and we have been privileged to have her teach for us in the Catholic Studies Rome program for, we've determined, for some years. For some years. And part of the great value of Dr. Lev for our program is precisely because she has this remarkable ability to integrate the culture, the religion, and serious art history all together so that our students can really develop an appreciation of what they're seeing in its context. In addition to being a remarkable teacher, Dr. Lev is also an author. And it just makes me smile to look at the 3 books so far that she's authored. The first, The Tigress of Forlì. For those of you who don't know the book, enjoy this subtitle. Renaissance Italy's Most Courageous and Notorious Countess, Caterina Riaro Sforza de' Medici. Pardon my pronunciation of the Italian. If you haven't read the book, those of you who have studied with Dr. Lev know, boy, can she tell a story. If you want to hear her tell one humdinger of a story, or a reader telling one humdinger of a story, that's the book, The Tigress of Forlì, in 2011. 2 years later, with George Weigel, Roman Pilgrimage, The Station Churches, a book everywhere in winter and spring in Rome for those doing the station churches. George Weigel's meditations, and they're fine, but it's the one-page description of the 54 station churches, the art and architecture of those 54 churches by Dr. Lev that, to me, is really the glory of that book. And then, most recently, with Jose Granados, I think it's my favorite, A Body for Glory. It's got two subtitles. Theology of the Body in the Papal Collections. And if that isn't clear, the Ancients, Michelangelo, and John Paul II. It's published by the Vatican Museum, so good luck getting a copy of it when you're in Rome. Get a copy. And it has the great advantage, because it's published by the Vatican Museums, the photographs of the art is spectacular. It's a beautiful book, not to mention the text. One of the joys of my job of being director of the Catholic Studies Rome program here stateside is I get to go to Rome from time to time just to make sure that all the pieces and elements of our Rome program are working together. And one of the pieces is the art and architecture course. So poor Dr. Lev has to put up with a lunch with me. And I've had any number of wonderful lunches with Dr. Lev and her husband Thomas. And we talk shop. And then we get down to really important things like, what is Dr. Lev thinking about now? And I have had any number of conversations about Michelangelo's women. And last time I was in Rome, I asked some version of the question, would you come to St. Thomas and talk about anything? To which he said yes, and I think I said some version of, and it would be really nice if it was Michelangelo's women. And I am just delighted that not only did she say yes to the invitation, but she said yes to Michelangelo's women. And so we have tonight's lecture, Michelangelo's Women, How the Renaissance Master Reinvented the Female Form. It is my delight to introduce to you this evening Dr. Elizabeth Lev.
I can't even begin to think how I'm going to live up to that, except for being crazy. I was listening to you and somehow or another describe those books. You forgot the original subtitle of Body for Glory, Naked People in the Vatican. But as I was listening to you describe them, I realized how much, especially with the station churches and the Body for Glory book, how much the Catholic Studies students were part of that. I remember writing it, I remember giving them papers and watching them complain and thinking, you try writing 54 descriptions of churches with George Weigel breathing down your neck. And I remember, most importantly, I remember a lot of you being at the station churches and that wonderful experience in the spring of bonding as we stood there freezing cold in February after being in the pouring rain. So it's exciting to have this new project is also the fruit of our time together in many different ways. We've spent, several of you have had papers that are going to look remarkably familiar, some of these things in here. What was that? And so I just wanted this. It's a wonderful thing to be here and to be kind of producing what I've been doing while I've been making you suffer, and to share with you a little bit what I've been working on. So this is called Women of the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo's Women. It's something that kind of caught my attention very many years ago, but I dare say about 5 years ago I started seriously thinking about it, and then 2 years ago I was fortunate enough to be given a grant so that I could really settle in and dig into this topic. And it has a lot to do with just simply understanding in the city of Rome, where we have so much of Michelangelo's art, it's pretty basic that we all kind of have a really good sense of Michelangelo's. Uh-oh, am I having a fight already with the little machine-y thingy? Ooh, this is fun. I'm having a technological issue, but every single student knows if I take something technological in my hand, something will go wrong. Thank you for preparing me for that. And now, okay, anyway, so I'll just keep talking while we wait for the pictures to start. This is every day at the Angelicum. So we're starting with Michelangelo's Mighty Men here. So I think it's pretty easy that if we start thinking about Michelangelo, the first thing that comes to mind are these very typical, huge images of Michelangelo's colossal men. So here you have his David, you have Adam, and you have All right, we'll see how this goes. And we also have what I affectionately like to call Terminator Jesus. I think you've all heard that one. At one point or another, the one that I like to think is giving a whole new meaning to the words, I'll be back. All right, we're gonna have a serious talk now. And what often gets lost in this is an understanding of Michelangelo's women, who are, all right, we're gonna get this right. There we go. We're going to understanding Michelangelo's women. His women are actually numerous, and they're quite varied, but we tend to kind of boil them down to these super muscular women or the mild-mannered Madonna, and it becomes a very simplistic view. So as if Michelangelo had this huge variety of men that he was able to conceive of, and his women were pretty much limited to women who looked like men, or women who had no personality whatsoever. And what's more, that over the years, that kind of somewhat superficial or somewhat immediate reading of Michelangelo's art, it's also led to a sort of an understanding that Michelangelo was one of two things. He's either a product of his age. He's either producing a very sort of second-rate woman who is either a woman who looks like a man, because that's the only way that he can conceive perfection, and that, of course, would be a reflection of this patriarchal society in which he lived, in which this incapable of recognizing the potential greatness of woman, or of course it comes from the perceived homosexuality of Michelangelo's. Therefore, the only thing that he could ever see that was beautiful was the male form. And this was actually, I'm going to fight with this all night long. This is codified, surprisingly, and this is kind of what began to galvanize me into work in 2009, 2010, when the Academia, which is, of course, the great repository of Michelangelo's sculptures, presented side by side with, he shows the photographs of Robert Mapplethorpe, and the whole idea behind it was to kind of create this equality between the two artists. They're basically the same, and what makes them the same, and this is where I think this gets a little interesting, is the curator of the show, the director of the Academia, said that his work, this is all about form. And in the work of Michelangelo, and ergo Mapplethorpe, form is a value in and of itself and should be considered, form as its own value, regardless of any subject matter and the baggage of personal experience. And in thinking that way, therefore, that baggage of personal experience also excludes from the consideration of Michelangelo's art the idea of his faith, the idea of his formation, the idea of his context and his society. And that is in the school of art history that I worked in Bologna. That's not exactly how we think about things. So tonight, I'm going to try to show you a different view of Michelangelo, examining him from several different points of view. The first and foremost, I find just to make it kind of clear, I'm in severe objection to just the mere form argument, and I don't believe that Michelangelo is a product of this society that denigrates women. And I also find that discussing Michelangelo from the point of view of a perceived homosexuality, which I don't really believe exists either, but even so, viewing Michelangelo through his bedroom is not a way of understanding art. So we're going to try doing this the good old-fashioned way that we do this in art history. We're going to look at some pictures. Art history, we look at pictures. Some of you have had to do slide IDs for examinations, might be thinking, way too many pictures, but the fact of the matter is, and as I tell you all the time, it's about the more pictures you know, the more evidence you have to make your argument. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to look at Michelangelo from a couple points of view. We're going to look at the people, the women he actually knew. So we're going to get a little bit of a sense of, so who did this guy know? Was he born in a kind of female vacuum? We're going to be looking at mostly the art of the Sistine Chapel. I'm going to be focusing, otherwise we will be here all night and for the rest of the semester, but to try to keep things down to a dull roar, I'm going to be focusing primarily on the Sistine Chapel, where, amazingly enough, you will find that there is an incredible variety of female figures. When you really stop and look at that Sistine Chapel, and you stop looking at the 20,000 people who are around you, and you stop worrying about the selfies, and you stop worrying about the guards, silence, you just forget about all that, and you just start looking at that ceiling, the next thing you know, you're going to notice that Michelangelo managed to create an exceptional variety of women in that ceiling. And that's what we'll be looking at tonight. And then I'm going to close with the woman who is the ultimate inspiration of every single other woman he paints or represents or sculpts. The woman who opened his body of work and closed his body of work. When he made the Madonna of the Stairs when he was still a child, and the Rodinini Pietà as he was dying. Michelangelo's entire life is bracketed by images of Mary. So we're going to be focusing on her at the very end of this. So we're going to start with, who does Michelangelo, what's Michelangelo's situation? A lot has been made, and I don't know how many times I've read these interpretations of the youthful Mary of the Pietà, because Michelangelo is missing his mommy, who died when he was 6. And so it gives the idea of a Michelangelo who was basically orphaned of a mother. That's not quite right. If you look at this little scheme of things, Michelangelo's the one who's kind of arranged in yellow, but you'll see that his father actually remarried. Ludovico Buonarroti was first married to Francesco Rucellai, and then married Lucrezia di Guagliardi Ubaldi, and so for 10 years she took care of the family. He also had a really interesting kind of household arrangement where the father and the brother both lived together, and so he had an aunt who was very close to him, and he had two maternal and maternal grandmother who his paternal grandmother lived with him. His maternal grandmother, we now believe, is the woman who ended up introducing him to Lorenzo the Magnificent. So there's already a fair amount there's a little bit more female to Michelangelo's household than we might think. There's also something kind of interesting. These are sort of the extra people who show up a lot in his biography. He claims to Vasari when he talks about how he became a sculptor, he said, if I'm any good at all, Giorgio, it's because I sucked in my love of sculpture with the milk of my nurse, who was the wife of a stonecutter. He refers to her very fondly in his youth. He also, this is gonna be the worst day with me and this thing. He also loved a woman named Vittoria Colonna. This is a very famous and well-documented love that he had. It's considered a platonic love because she was a very, very respectable widow, but he spoke of her with tremendous affection, did a lot of works of art for her, and she was an exceptional woman. But here's the one I'm the most interested in. You know, the very first lines of Michelangelo's biography to Ascanio Condivi, he dictated them. Michelangelo dictated that biography. It was his story as he wanted to tell it. The very first paragraph, where do you come from? Who's Michelangelo? Where does he come from? Well, we are descended from the lords of Canossa. And in particular, he talks about being descended of the Lord of Canossa and the Matilda of Canossa. She is Countess Matilda of Tuscany. She was an 11th century countess, and he refers to her as a lady of rare and singular prudence and piety who did in her lifetime many things worthy of memory. So his absolute highest memory, the highest person of his family, is a matriarch. He considers himself descended from her. And so just to give you a little bit of an idea of a Michelangelo who, while he works mostly for ecclesiastical patrons, which means he'll mostly work for men, he's working in the church, he doesn't do portraits. So the other place where you would see artists in contact with women a great deal was when they do portraits. Michelangelo doesn't do portraits. But in his life, it's not really this dearth of women as one might think. But now I'm going to get to what I'm really after. The Sistine Chapel is a repository of an exceptional variety of female figures, as I was saying. And it is, of course, the place where the papal court met, so 350 to 500 men met in that chapel. And the fact of the matter is that this chapel reflects the spirit of the court praying together. Above their head is the ceiling, 5,000 square feet of paint. And in that 5,000 square feet of painting, Michelangelo painted an array of women, including sibyls, prophetesses. He painted heroines. He painted Eve, first mother, and he had a particular interest in painting mothers in general. And so what I've found when I'm working on this that I truly find amazing is one of the things that's been most ignored of the Sistine Chapel. In the Sistine Chapel, we have a series of families represented in the undercroft. All those little circles represent this genealogy of Christ. They are hidden underneath the vault, and basically until last October, when the Vatican Museums put in a brand new lighting system, which is much more potent, the fact of the matter is it was hard to see a little bit, even though the painting technique was done in such a way to make them noticeable. But this is, all those figures you see there are all mothers. And when you look at Michelangelo's representation of mothers, you see a painter who is very different from the man who does those iconic Sibyls, very different from the sculptor who did the Pietà, a man who has a remarkably fresh, original view of motherhood that looks like he's standing in a street, just a street of Florence. And he started already with an iconographical novelty. He's doing, this is, the idea of the genealogy comes from the Gospel of Matthew, the opening genealogy of the 42 generations from Abraham to Christ. As you know, there are two. There's Luke's, which is 77. There's Matthew's, which is 42. It's much more manageable to do Matthew's, but you also probably know Matthew only mentions 5 women. The genealogy of Christ is male-driven, and so there are 5 women mentioned in that lineup. But Michelangelo painted 22. And he painted in such a way that, as you can already see in this little preview here, every father is accompanied by a mother. And you see family units where Michelangelo created, invented these companions, these consorts, these wives for these men, and he pairs them all the way through the chapel. So you're moving through a genealogy that not only takes you through time, but it takes you through time with a remarkably close-up view of family life. And there's a little technical point that I think you might find that's particularly important about these. These are executed with exceptional swiftness. So just so you realize, my students should all know this, the technique that they are painted in is called fresco. The fresco involves putting a slaked lime plaster up on a wall. You put a layer of watercolor on top of it, and it dries into colored stone. For that reason, restorers or experts can always tell how long it takes to paint a painting because only the amount of plaster, you can see the seams between the plaster. In the genealogy of Christ, the amount of days, giornate, work days, was 1, 2, maximum 3. He's working at incredible speed here. When you get to the Sibyls, and when you get to the prophets, and when you get to the other figures, they start to be 18 to 20 days. So these are much more studied, much more drawn, much more thought out, whereas these figures here have virtually no lines incised into the stone, so that what you're looking at, what that all translates into, is to a man who's got an idea in his head and he's translating it into paint at high speed because it's like a candid photograph. What you and I do with a phone camera, Michelangelo's doing when he's capturing portraits of men, women, and children in this undercroft. So to begin with, there is in that section a freshness in his painting, an immediacy that we're not accustomed to. We are much more used to his very posed, very studied, look how incredibly complicated this position is, only I can do this, don't pay attention to that Leonardo guy. But with these, we see a very kind of immediate, it's almost like he's sketching in paint. And the other thing that I'm starting with, the thing that I began to realize that is amazing, he got really interested in clothes, especially when he's working in the first half of the ceiling, when he's working a little bit more slowly. And so you start to notice that the women in the first half of the ceiling, they're all wearing these kind of wild outfits. They have very elaborate headdresses. There's detail on the clothing that's very much from the 15th, 16th century. So this is not a Michelangelo for once. Michelangelo is not sitting in the papal gardens or in Lorenzo the Magnificent's ancient sculpture collection looking at the ancient sculptures and bringing them back to life. For once, Michelangelo's looking out at the women he sees walking down the street, and he's capturing a little bit of daily life. Now, He's never going to be in that sort of, this is Mary's fabulous, first of all, she's got that really cool rainbow scarf, which I think most of us would buy if we saw it in a stall in Florence. And then I'm not so sure about the hat. I think maybe we could just give that one a miss. But before we put this down to Michelangelo's weird or sort of desire to make alien outfits, let's take a look at what's going on. Florentines love headdresses. They love fancy veils. As a matter of fact, they love them so much that the Florentines had to pass a law that you could not carry a 13-foot veil trailing behind you because the Florentines love their hats. Now, you have a Filippo Lippi who in this wonderful Madonna, a Child and Two Angels, shows you how to paint a veil if you want to make sure no one else will ever be able to compete with you in veil painting. It's an incredibly complex piece of painting, which I think when those of us who went to Florence, you just look at it, when you begin to think about the technique involved here, you begin to realize that this is the work of a professional painter. He didn't really go that route, Michelangelo, but Pollaiuolo, who was a sculptor painter, you'll notice that he went with a headdress that is very, very similar to what's going on with Mary's robe, these sort of much more complicated architectural hairstyle. But what I'm telling you is that that thing on Mary's head is not quite so far-fetched. It has much more of a linear sculptural effect, which is a way that certain types of artists move into, but it puts Michelangelo in line with the generation before him. He also he cut his teeth in the Tornabuoni Chapel, painting there from 1485 to 1490. So he was still very, very young when he signed on. He was about 13 when he signed on here. And he worked for a man named Ghirlandaio. I'm just making one last little point here. Ghirlandaio is from a family that made headdresses. So Ghirlandaio's secret to his success is that he was really good at painting clothes. And so Ghirlandaio got all these jobs working for the big Medici friends who sold fabulous cloths and had all these great showrooms, probably down by the Ponte Vecchio. And so Michelangelo picked up probably his ability to paint that kind of clothing in here. Here you have a woman who's not named, her name isn't anywhere, but we see her as the wife of Eleazar, and she's wearing an outfit which is a very contemporary look. That idea of the camicia, the gamura, which is an overdress, which is laced up the sides, then you could interchange your sleeves. So just in case you were wondering, back in the 16th, 17th century, how did you dash up your outfit? You changed your sleeves out. And the sleeves could get terribly expensive. So there you go. And so you'll see her with this, and you'll see there's a little bit of ribbon, a little bit of decoration. And here is Ghirlandaio, who is producing, obviously Ghirlandaio's also professional painter, so he's going to pay a lot more attention to the almost Flemish type of representation of the cloth. But again, what I'm getting at is that this is a man who's not swathing a woman in like the typical ancient robe, not even something that's meant to really just kind of be a piece of drapery like you see on statues, but he's out there looking at these women. And so, I love the way her husband looks a little afraid of her. That's my favorite part of the close-up. So, just a little. So these are two different types of painting clothing is where I'm going with this. One type is the very, very complicated Ghirlandaio. That's Giovanna Torna. She's the daughter of the richest man and one of the richest men in Florence. So I think it's safe to say that you want to get her clothes right. But on the other one, you also see a kind of complicated piece of clothing where this piece falls off the side. The headdress has this extra sort of ribbon in it. It has a sash around the waist to show off her body. And I'm going to take advantage of that image to read you a little bit of Michelangelo's erotic poetry. Just what you need after dinner. And this is a surprise one. I mean, there are a whole bunch of those poems that people like pull out from Michelangelo, but this is one. He wrote this while he was painting that. And in this little piece of erotic poetry by Michelangelo, he imagines that he is a woman's dress. Not in a woman's dress, that he is a woman's dress. And so he says, All through the day her dress is well contented. It binds her breast and then seems to stretch, and what they call the filigree gold has touched her neck and cheeks and cannot make an end. But happier still, that ribbon seems delighted, having a golden tip made in a manner to press and touch the chest that it has yoked. And I believe the simple sash that's knotted says to itself, I'd fashion here forever. So how would it then be that my arms would act? So this sort of imagining himself as sort of a caressing, accompanying, surrounding this woman by being her dress. I don't suggest you try this at home. Maybe John Mayer will write a song about it. But anyway, the fact is, it gives us, I'm just trying to show you a man that when he said he's between the age of 33 and 37, and he's got a little bit of a roving eye. For a man who grew up with a whole bunch of brothers, he seems to have a pretty good eye for Florentine costumes, for headdresses, for braids, for ribbons. The other thing that is very striking about these mother images is the incredible intimacy that he gives you. And so beyond kind of the cute thing of the clothing, what is amazing is how intimate these scenes become. So this is a work of Ghirlandaio, again, the project that Michelangelo was involved in as a child in the Tornabuoni Chapel. And one of the most singular things about it is that in this project, there are 16 panels. There are 16 panels of that whole chapel. Of the 16, only 2 don't have women. One is because it's the Annunciation of Zechariah, and the other one is, I forget what the story is. There are only 2 that don't have women. 4 are completely dominated by women. And that one, which is on the lowest level, it's one of the easiest things that you can see. Take a look at that. You have just walked into a birthing room in a Florentine house with details to make you feel like you're actually in the room. Giovanna Torna showing up to see the birth of the Virgin, which happened considerably before she was born. But for all of that magnitude, the birth of Mary, the magnitude of that story, it suddenly becomes a Florentine domestic scene with the most charming and wonderful part of it is that apple-cheeked nurse who is beaming at that baby. So we just had Brandon's baby in here, and everybody starts beaming with this sort of joyous expression to see a baby. All of a sudden, that intimacy of the holding that newborn baby, seeing that infant child and that joy the child brings. Again, Ghirlandaio took that out of the Florentine life. He didn't have to stop with Ghirlandaio. Even in the Sistine Chapel, there's an exceptional number of images of women in families. This is Perugino's Death of Moses, and here you have some pretty busy mothers in the foreground. You have one who's obviously very pregnant with another one that's trying to pull her hair out, and then you have a little nursing mother in the corner, mother holding another climby baby. Look at this. This is part of the repertoire. But Michelangelo took that figure, which is just, see, they're sort of part of a big group there. Michelangelo is going to take that intimacy and he's going to highlight it. These women are they have a great deal of close focus, and Michelangelo's mothers, they are busy. As a matter of fact, of the 22 women that he painted, 14 are busy doing something. Only 5 men are doing anything. The fathers are mostly portrayed as sleeping. I'm just saying. And so, or looking busy writing, but really sleeping. So again, this takes, because of the tremendous variety of what women are doing. So this one is setting a table, that one is being jumped on by children. You'll see women who are brushing their hair. There's one who's just sort of brushing her hair in the sun. Another one who's weaving with a spindle. He's looking out, he's looking at the streets, he's looking at these women, and he's bringing everyday domestic life, and he's making it iconic in that chapel where you would have only 350 to 500 men, bringing the full experience of Christian life into that Christian space with its everydayness. So you have these two, you have the sketches. Even the sketches are amazing. They're so fast. It's like he's trying to catch them before they're going to disappear. Over here, oops, I keep doing this the wrong way. Over there, you have a little image of a mother He's trying to figure out how to make a nursing mother, and the writing you see underneath it says, dagli da bere, give him something to drink. So this idea of working out how to make this image of nursing, which results in this amazing, is my favorite. This is the ultimate multitasking mother, right? So you've got, I don't know what he's doing, is he catching a couple Z's? But she's got one baby painted in fabulous perspective, and she's rocking the cradle with the other foot. So in the midst of this work, in the midst of this monumental, incredibly important ceiling, he finds time to add these images of these busy, lively mothers. I find a really interesting comparison here. These mothers, of course, around the image where you have God, which a colleague of mine used to call this God's busy day. Because this is God who's kind of rushing in and rushing out, and he's dropping off the sun and the moon and the vegetable life while he's at it. But the fact is this busy, busy, busy God, and that's where you find these women finding their true matrix, in the busy God who creates these women. So beyond Adam, who, yes, is made in the image and likeness of God, we have these women who give life and nurture life, who are also honored just as much as God, or as God is creating the sun, moon, and vegetable life. So it's just sort of and just a little fun fact about Michelangelo in this period that when I was working on this, it all of a sudden occurred to me. He was between the ages of 33 and 37, right? He's just got a super high-paying job in the Sistine Chapel. His career is assured. Do you know what every single prelate says to him when they pass him on the street? Every single one is, "So, Mike, when you get married," right? They're making Raphael get married. Raphael had to get married when he was 37. He died to avoid it, but he was supposed to. And Michelangelo is they're trying to figure out, hey, Mike, do you need me to introduce you to my niece, to my cousin? And Michelangelo said later, he never married, he said his art was a harsh enough mistress and his paintings were his children. So indeed, he never married, but it's something that he felt, he came up with his line as to why he didn't do it, but it would have been very much on his mind. And you can sort of see him looking at these mothers almost as if he's speculating, is this my vocation? Is this the path for me? Well, from here, we're going to look a little bit further into the ceiling, and we're going to see heroines. We're moving on to the next group, who are the heroines, and they occupy 2 of the 4 corners of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. So you have these anchors of the ceiling leading down into the side walls, where you have 2 heroes and 2 heroines. So once again, we find that complementarity. We have, for every male hero, there's a female heroine. And we're going to start with Judith and Holofernes, the famous widow, who succeeded in disarming and beheading the Assyrian general who had every intention of destroying her city. And in some really terrific storytelling, because Michelangelo's very good. By the way, her clothes are great. I'm just saying. In this really kind of cool scene, Judith is absconding with the head of Holofernes. The head is in the hands of her servant, who's always with her, because a huge part of the story involves her chastity, or chasteness in the story. The head, by the way, in the tray, is the only identified portrait of Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Make of that what you will. And the very interesting part of the way that this is designed is, look at Judith, who is in the center. Her back is to you. She's covering the head. She's making her escape. And it's as if she hears a noise. So she turns somewhat suddenly to look back at the bed where Holofernes has died in a very unrealistic position. But the fact is, she's the dead center. Do you see how the light falls on her? She's the pivot, she's the center, she's the actor, she's the protagonist of this story, and she's at the core, and she moves she is the pivot with which the 2 sides of the scene work. She is the active heroine, the one who went out and got it done, but that's not the only kind of heroics that we recognize. Just as a little note about how this looked before, because in art history we do comparisons, Botticelli, I love Botticelli, but this is not perhaps the most dramatic story you've ever told. She's coming home and carrying the head in a basket. Donatello did a Judith. It was one of the symbols they liked for Florence. So you have Judith, who's he looks dead already, and they're just doing the nicety of removing the head. And Judith is always paired with David, by the way. This is a very, very common pairing, which Michelangelo also does by giving us David and Goliath directly opposite. So on the entryway, you'll have Judith here and David and Goliath here. So again, these very active, and unlike the David he did in Florence, this isn't David 5 minutes before the battle thinking, maybe I could escape out the back door. This is David who's really in the thick of it, as it were. So this is the active type of heroine. Another thing that this leads into is a quick glance over at the Last Judgment, where we begin to realize that the church has a long recognition of great female heroines, starting with the martyrs. And one of the points that I would want to bring out is that Michelangelo is not really a product of a church that somehow denigrates women, because and by any stretch of the imagination, are the churches dedicated to the St. Agnes's, the St. Cecilias, the St. Dorothy's, the St. Agathas, are they in any way, shape, or form smaller or less prestigious or less beautiful than the churches dedicated to St. Sebastian, to St. Pancrazio? So this idea of, in Rome, do they have some sort of lesser position in the liturgical calendar when we remember their feast days? Do we wear a slightly off red when it comes to the female martyrs? No. The female martyrs from the get-go have been honored side by side with the male martyrs. And in the 4th and 5th century, when they're trying to figure out how to talk about these women who are willing to face the enemy in the ring, willing to face death in the ring, they can't find a terminology among the language of the Latin, the Romans, and the Greeks that talk about women who make choices, see them through with determination, with power. And so they have to create a language. The language of Andrea, taking from the Greek to make a woman who acts like a man, or taking from the Latin, virago, a woman who is like a man, because the poverty of the language doesn't allow them to express the greatness of what they're seeing. And so these heavens athletes, I actually now believe very firmly that the two women on the lower left-hand side are Perpetua and Felicity. And their bodies are, of course, made far more powerful. But Perpetua, on the eve of her martyrdom, has a dream in which she becomes a man, and she gets into the ring to fight a gladiator who is the devil incarnate. And so this idea of what it takes, these man-like qualities, it brings us to the question, if you're trying to show great inner fortitude, if you're trying to show women with great inner fortitude, how are you going to do it in a medium that only allows you to express the exterior? And so the choices to make, both John the Baptist, who you see over there on the right, who, if I remember correctly, lived on locusts and wild honey. And although I haven't tried it, I don't think it's exactly a bulk-up diet. And then Perpetua and Felicity, both bodies are distorted to represent the courage, the strength, the winner's circle of these people who have given up their lives. And so this vision of heroine that Michelangelo matures from the time of his Judith to the time of these great women that you see collected in heaven, again expressing this idea of the heroic female. Time to go. Yes. All right. So the other type of heroine is Esther. So in Esther, we have the punishment of Haman. We have Xerxes over there reclining on the bed, and of course, the beautiful, beautiful Esther, who has become the wife of the king because of her extraordinary beauty. She must go and intercede in order to try to save the life of her uncle Mordecai and his companions against Haman, who would see them killed. It's terrifying for her to enter into that room. It's a death sentence, and so she braves it anyway. She doesn't carry a sword. She doesn't come home with anybody's head, but instead it's her beauty that moves the king. And this she's completely hidden away. So it's very hard to find her. Do you see where she is now? So you have Haman stretching in the distance. You have Xerxes reaching out. You have the guy who's standing halfway in the doorway. But then you have this little face that appears. And there's no way that figure is modeled on a man. That beautiful, delicate, elegant face, that nervous, timid intercession of this heroine whose power is in her sweetness, in her beauty. And so these two different ways of being heroines, both recognized in the Sistine Chapel ceiling, with this one given a slight precedence. Because instead of going at the entrance and exit door, the point where you enter the chapel, these two frame the altar. She's framed, Esther is together with Moses and the brazen serpent. And so on either side above the space, which is indicative of salvation, flanking Jonah of the Sistine Chapel, we see this heroine of beauty, this heroine of intercession. So, from here, we move on to the Sibyls. And the Sibyls are where Michelangelo forayed a lot. Sibyls are prophetesses to the, ancient world. There are 5 in the Sistine Chapel ceiling for the 7 prophets. So 5 female Sibyls, 7 male prophets. The reason for this is that way you can anchor Zechariah on the far left with Jonah on the far right. So the axis of the altar, the Pope's axis, would have a male on either side, but you'll have a complete complementarity along the side walls. They are incredibly varied, really remarkably varied. The Sibyls start with the Delphic Sibyl, the Sibyl, the Oracle of Apollo. She's youthful, she's strong, she's energetic, she's obviously a very studied figure. She's got this arm that twists out into your space, the head that turns the other way, and yet nonetheless elegant and feminine. This one is very frequently, the Cumean Sibyl is very frequently used as an example of the, oh, look at Michelangelo who hates women. There is a little point to the reason why the Cumean Sibyl might look like that. For those of you who know your ancient mythology, the Cumean Sibyl was a young woman who was extraordinarily gifted with sight of the future. She was also very beautiful. And she was loved by the god Apollo, and the god Apollo came up, made his usual god proposals, and she demurred, and then she said, well, maybe I could think about it if you gave me a little gift. And she said, well, what would you like? And he said, well, I thought I could have eternal life. And he said, done. She forgot to ask for eternal youth. And so she's a very, very famous figure for the fact that she ages and ages and ages. But more importantly about these Sibyls, think about the authority that they're given in this image. These are the figures that are putatively prophesizing to the Gentiles the coming of Christ. Are you going to make them wimpy? Are you going to make them uncertain? Are you going to make them shy, delicate, blushing figures? These are people who have an announcement to make. They need to have the auctoritas, they need to have the gravitas, and Michelangelo finds a tremendous variety, 5 different women who look completely different, culminating in one of his greatest figures of all time. Let's turn. Thank you. The Libyan Sibyl. So these build up from that Delphic Sibyl at the beginning. We go through the Cumean, the wizened Cumean Sibyl. We go through the Persian Sibyl, and then we get to the culmination right before the altar. One of the most spectacular figures he ever painted. The Libyan Sibyl, painted from the back, already a pose that has only been seen but rarely. The other artist who, come on, be nice to me. The other artist who does this is Botticelli. And so Botticelli, now this is going to be a very bizarre comparison, but pay attention for a second, it will work. Michelangelo's Libyan Sibyl is by far the most mighty of the figures. She has a very broad wingspan, and she's closing the book of the prophecies. But on the other hand, Botticelli's female figures are also completely grounded in a type of unrealistic body type. His figures are always elongated. They don't seem to have any weight or mass because he too uses his female figures as allegories. He makes these light, ethereal figures to give you the idea of something that's drawing you up out of this world up into a higher plane. Michelangelo's women are also indicating a higher plane, but they're indicating it with a force and authority. But you'll see there's even a little similarity in the way they draw these. Look at this. Look at these strong. The Libyan Sibyl has these very strong arms, but that same beautiful lift of the arm, the same even. I'm trying to think of a more proper word, but it's frankly a little sexy. The dip of the dress on either side, both of them with the very cinched waist, the dip of the dress. There is Michelangelo's mighty woman, Botticelli's very, very, very delicate woman, but they are both women that are taken to represent something that is more allegorical, not the kind of candid photo of the mothers, but something that's already promising and pointing towards, their signs and symbols pointing towards something greater. And then, just a little note as we talk about this, I'm always a little surprised that people are so surprised by this, because you see flashing by, the past century in body types for women. So you went from the very sensual, very Rita Hayworths and Marilyn Monroe's, but these women who were never really seen to be very strong. As a matter of fact, one of the things about Marilyn is this vulnerability, that sort of soft, yielding vulnerability. Then you move to that very sort of almost everything about the woman was canceled with this extreme emaciation of the years of Twiggy, and the other one was Diane Keaton, believe it or not. And then we moved into the 80s, and in the 80s it all got to be about physical fitness. And so it amazes me that our day and age really has some sort of head scratching about Michelangelo. Ever since Cindy Crawford put out her workout videos, what do women want to be? They want to be strong, they want to be muscular, they want to be powerful. And of course, I took Charlize Theron from Mad Max Fury Road, who wins Oscars by changing her body type, and gives us one of the most beautiful women in the world sitting there, bulked up, looking like a superhero. And this is something that we expect when we see anyone. Oh, are you going to be in the new Avengers movie? How are you training for your role? Well, I'm eating lots of protein and I work out with a trainer every day. Oh, do you read a script? No, but I work out with a trainer for 8 hours a day. I mean, this idea of the strong woman is very, very, very much part of our present day and age. In the strong, competent body, the body that can work, that can take care of children, that can travel, that can do everything it needs to do. That's part of our culture. So the fact that somehow we think that we invented this in the 21st century, when indeed it looks like Michelangelo has kind of beat us out to it. I actually did once think about writing the secret workout tips encoded in the Sistine Chapel. I have a feeling it would be more successful than anything else I ever did. So a little, just to deal with a little bit the way this works, male models are used in preparatory drawings. There is just a technical fact about the images of male and female figures in art. 9 times out of 10, when you're dealing with a figure that looks female, it is most often, if the figure requires a lot of body drawing, it will be a man. Because the only way you're going to see a woman in that state of undress if she's your wife. And so Michelangelo wasn't married, Bunsen wasn't married, Ghirlandaio was not going to bring his wife into the studio and have her disrobe for the group. So the fact is that most of the time they would choose a male, a rather youthful guy in the studio, and they would use him for their drawings. And so you see Michelangelo, clearly the matrix of the Libyan Sibyl was a male. So is Raphael's Sibyl. That figure on the left-hand side is a boy. But the head he's already been transforming to try to get an idea of how to make it more female. So Michelangelo has a huge effect on Sibyl drawing. These are the Sibyls from Santa Maria sopra Minerva. They are sort of the Botticelli-esque vein. They're by Filippino Lippi. And then Raphael all of a sudden shows up with these nice, big, solid Sibyls who are reaching, moving, acting in Santa Maria della Pace. But when you look at them up close, Raphael added, there's this big old monster male arm here, right? And then you have like this tiny little head, little girly head. But Michelangelo, even though she's got very strong shoulders and got an awful lot going on here in the what's it, the deltoids, he tightens this waist. He puts the sash around her waist tightly. But one of the things I think is sort of a very elegant form of eroticism is the way he folds up that flame-colored robe, and you have that sheer fabric that plays around her ankles, a softness that he won't give to the body. He won't give the body softness and yielding and plumpness and weakness and languidness, but he gives it to the drapery that covers her. So but this is one of the last things he paints, and he's really beginning to master an image of these kind of women. And I love this. So it's time to make Rosie the Riveter, right? The emblematic of the woman, our men are off to war, we can do it, right? Where did we go to get our image of Rosie the Riveter? Michelangelo. And what's more, here's what she really looked like. So this was the model for Rosie the Riveter, and you can see again the idea of this lovely slim woman who was transposed or transformed into this kind of pretty little face, but this big strong body of a woman who can do it. And so we did find a way to even use Michelangelo's art in our own. Well, this brings us to Eve, and we're beginning to get somewhere. Eve is the central figure of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. So what you've done is you've gone from the very decorated, sort of extremely dressed figures on the lower section. We come up through the heroines, and we come up through the sibyls, who are also wearing their sort of elaborate dress. And then we get to the beginning of everything. We get to the mother of all the living, that Eve, who is plunked right in the middle of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. There are 4 images of Eve in the Sistine Chapel. They are always with Adam. They are the matrix, they are the paradigm, they are the beginning of what we find down at the bottom with the mothers and fathers, because as you can see, Adam is still sleeping. And the way that Eve he looks at it as flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone. So this equalness. She's not weaker than he is. She's not smaller than he is. Here you have these sort of, they're very beautiful, as a matter of fact, both Jacopo della Quercia and Ghiberti's, but they're these sylph-like figures. But here is flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone. And what I find particularly interesting about this, what I've been thinking about a lot, is the way that she's the bridge between man and God. The way that she comes out is not the same where you have her just sort of floating before God, but she actually is like a ponte. She's a bridge between man and God, closing with that gesture of supplication, closing with that gesture of prayer. Let's move. And then, of course, we have the center figure of the center image of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, where, amazingly enough, whoops, Daisy, that was not the smartest thing I've ever done. Amazingly enough, there's Eve. Everywhere Adam is, Eve is. So this complementarity comes to a head when you are looking at the Sistine Chapel, the dead center, 3 panels of the dead center of the ceiling. God's creating stuff before and man's messing it up afterwards. But the 3 in the middle are the creation of man, the creation of woman, and the fall of man. And there in the creation of man is this amazing image of Eve, whose hand is curled around God with such intimacy, such closeness. She's seen in that room, in that space where they sang the Psalms on Good Friday and on Good Holy Saturday. They sang the Exultet that sings about happy fault, the happy fault, the happy fault of Eve that brought man into the world. God's arm curls around her shoulder, and it ends on the shoulder of the child Jesus looking out at you. So this amazing picture where even as God is creating man, he's not the only thing happening here. There's also the plan for woman, and through woman there's the plan for salvation. And then we have Adam and Eve always together. Again, they're together in the beautiful pictures when they were together. They were naked, they were without shame, their bodies fit together. And again, look at the complementarity. They both have the bodies of immortals. Those are bodies that won't get sick, they won't die, they won't age. But at the same time, he's a little bit more aggressive and she's a little bit more languid. And already that sort of complementarity in the characteristics. As they come out, as they're cast out of Eden, their bodies change again. And there's some very interesting contemporary writing that happens here. A very beautiful writing by Boccaccio discusses this Eve who was a queen in heaven. She was immortal. And she had to live that transition of going from the immortal princess, mistress of Eden, to going out in the world where she would suffer the pains of childbirth, she would suffer the pains of loss, all of it. She also apparently would gain more weight, as you can see from this picture, and she has to go and find a home for her children. She must care for her children. She has to completely reorganize her ideas. She's the one who takes care of her children. She has to feed them. She has to clothe them. And so she falls into the shadow. And so in this one, you see her falling into the shadow of Adam. And then, this brings me to my culminating part. All of these women, every single one I've just showed you, they all are found in Mary. Michelangelo represented Mary more often than any other woman. He started his career with the Madonna of the Stairs. He ended his career with the Rodinini Pietà, with, again, a later version of Mary holding the lifeless Jesus. This is the work that catapulted him to fame. And his love of Mary, his fascination with Mary, during the course of he lived to be 89 years old. His first work is probably when he's about 13, 14, 15, about 15. The last work is 3 weeks before his 90th birthday. This is a man who spent his entire life thinking about Mary. And so, I always think of that Whitney Houston song when she sings, "I'm every woman, they're all in me." In a certain sense, that is for Michelangelo. She is every woman. We hear this when Jesus speaks to her at the beginning of his mission and the end of his mission, when he says, "Woman at Cana, what does this have to do with me?" When he says that on the cross, "Woman, behold thy son," consigning mankind to her. And therefore, all of these women, the universal woman contained in Mary. When she was younger, when he was younger, he made her as a sort of a tender and stylish mother. If you look at the outfit, I thought we'd go back to the clothes again. If you look at the outfit on the Today Tondo, Mary's wearing the same outfit, that sort of dropped shoulder, and she's got a very elaborate headdress on. Again, even in the Medici Madonna, you see a sort of an interest in a slightly more contemporary look. Then you have Mary as prophetess, and I thought this was a kind of interesting thing. That Michelangelo did the Bruges Madonna and the Pietà very, very close to each other. The Pietà comes first, the Bruges Madonna comes second. And the Madonna of Bruges is a very kind of melancholy-looking Madonna. She's sort of almost like of the Filippo Lippi stamp. And we've always seen in the Filippo Lippi Madonnas, the Sandro Botticelli sort of downcast, melancholy Madonnas, the Madonna who foresees everything that's going to happen. So she's holding this child in her lap. If you look, Jesus is taking a little step forward. And so it's like he's making his first foray away from his mother. It's like when your child first starts to walk and you let go of the hands and he steps out into the world. So as Mary prepares for that moment of letting her child step out into the world, that solemnity in her face, and it's a tremendous solemnity, seems to predict the sadness that will come. And as you always hear, Mary, she looks, she watches, she's silent, but she's always paying attention, and she's always looking a little further down the line. So take a look at these two Marys. The one on the right is that Bruges Madonna, and then we see that remarkable Mary of the Pietà, and sort of this continuity of the face of Mary. The Mary of the Pietà, who has now been handed her son back, he's lifeless, and she holds him in her arms for one last time, has that same expression of the mother who first let her son go out into this, first letting him go to take his first steps. So a Mary whose understanding of the arc of the story, from the birth of Christ to his death and to eventual resurrection, understands that this is part of the project of divine will. So in a certain sense, a prophetess. The active and contemplative heroine, this amazing Madonna, this Doni Tondo, which he made one time only. It's something you can only get away with in someone's house, because if you'll notice, Mary's sleeve is pushed way, 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 way back. You can't usually get away with that with Mary, Mother of God, but it was for a kind of edgy collector. And if you look at that position of Mary, look at the way that she seems to be sort of just seated there between the knees of Joseph, but look at the tension he put into that body. This young, vigorous woman, she's turning her body all the way back. It's like an unresolved chord. And you're waiting for the resolution. And the resolution only happens when she takes her son, she turns her body, and she brings him out to where the knees are projecting into our space. That active Mary who brought salvation into the world by saying yes to God. The active part of Mary's yes represented in the Doni Tondo, and as we've already said before, the contemplative part of Mary, whose yes was going to be a lot more than just an angel showing up in the room, these kind of fun fête champêtre with Joseph. It was going to be also that yes of Mary that would bring her to that ultimate acceptance, in which you see once again that expression of her fiat in the Pietà. So a Mary whose heroism is not just the heroism of of Judith, with that act of bringing God and salvation into the world, but also that heroism of an Esther, that intercessor, that beauty, that sweetness, and the acceptance. And then we also have the fact that Mary, all of this harkens to a theology dedicated to Mary as the new Eve. And instead of going into, that's a whole other argument in and of itself, but just to remind you of something that's often not very mentioned about Michelangelo. Michelangelo, not only did he not marry, but he ended up being a third order Franciscan. And so the moment that Michelangelo was working in the Sistine Chapel, he was working for Julius II, who was a Franciscan pope. He was working in a chapel built by Sixtus IV. Sixtus IV is the man who put the Immaculate Conception on the universal calendar and gave us the Immaculate Conception. He commissioned the two offices. One of the offices, written by Bernardino di Busti, makes a point of talking about Mary, mulier fortis, the strong woman. So we already begin to see that in the Franciscan line regarding Mary, the new Eve of the Immaculate Conception, there is a vision of this very strong Mary. And so again, just repeating this sort of idea of Mary who perfects Eve, who in sinning, as you see here, Eve loses, but in accepting divine will, Mary wins. And this brings me to the end. And the end is what I think where Michelangelo finally, after 30 years, got to really plainly show his hand. He was working on the Last Judgment in 1534. This is the middle of the Reformation. One of the things that the Reformation takes full aim at is the role of Mary in the church. And so as the reformers are questioning the church's devotion to Mary, this belief in Mary's intercession, there's a great deal of interest on the part of the church to really reinforce the church's love of Mary. And so when he painted the Last Judgment, he did something a little bit unusual. Here are the preparatory drawings. This is the only way you can really get proof from an artist, because even when they tell you things on paper, they're not always telling you the truth. But in this particular case, Michelangelo left us two drawings. In the first version of the Last Judgment, here is Jesus and here is Mary. Mary is sitting down below him. That's her typical place. John the Baptist usually goes over here. And she's standing up. She's kind of getting up to talk to Jesus. And her hands are clasped in front of her the same way that Eve's hands were clasped in front of her as she's coming out of Adam's side. The next one is another drawing. Now look where Mary has gone. Jesus is now beginning to rise. Mary has got up and she is standing right next to Jesus with her arms open. She's moved closer to him. In the finished product, he stopped messing around and he put Mary right next to Jesus. You want to talk to Jesus, you got to talk to his mom. And so there she is with the most exalted position. She doesn't go there. This is Giotto's Last Judgment. Jesus is seated by himself, but Mary becomes the key. She is right by the wound in Christ's side, from whence the church sprang. And so you have this lifting up, and you'll notice if you're ever looking at the painting that virtually all the figures in that painting are going to heaven. They pass up through Mary, through Christ's side to Jesus, and very, very small proportion are condemned. And in my favorite fun fact, which all of my students have heard, there are apparently no women in hell. So. This is just a little bit of a genesis of the figure. Mary is represented here in that crossed arm position, the same way that we see the Mary who is kneeling before the angel as she accepts that I am the handmaid of the Lord, let it be done to me according to thy will. And then he threw a curveball. That is a pagan statue of Venus. Crouching Venus, it's called, but it is unmistakable that the crouching Venus is what became that figure of Mary, a Mary who is beautiful, a Mary who is irresistible, a Mary who has that beauty, that power to incite love, much like Esther. And so, as a matter of fact, Esther is immediately to the left of Mary. He takes this remarkable, it's an incredible interpretation of a pagan work, and he turns it into this incredibly beautiful Mary who enjoys an exalted position as the love of Christ. Oops-a-daisy. And so again, this is your whole, you'll see they all come up the left-hand side, they go to Mary, they come down on the opposite side, and only a very, very small number at the very end are grouped into, are gathered into hell. And so with this, the fruit of this work is to begin to look at a story in which Michelangelo sees women as strong, sees women as powerful, because it's part of our church, it's part of our tradition. It's something that comes technically out of what has already happened before. He learns it from his masters, he learns it from the masters before him, and so in one hand, his technique is a perfection of what they're doing, but at the same time, his vision of women as being able to resist and throw off sin, to change their lives, to choose to follow Christ, and then to have the determination to do it, that is something that comes from our church. It comes from the very beginning when Saint Jerome looked at the women who chose chastity, and he called them these women with the courage of men to be able to take their lives into their hands and to follow Christ to the very end with the same determination that a man does. And that all of that, the great story of saying yes to God and following with determination to the bitter end, was most beautifully and most perfectly embodied by Mary, who in turn was able to influence and able to color all of these figures that Michelangelo made in the ceiling. If all those beautiful figures are facets, like you look into a diamond and you see all the different colors, the diamond itself, it's Mary. Thanks very much.
Dr. Lev has graciously agreed to take just a couple questions before we bring the evening to an end. I'll let you field your own questions.
All right. All right. Field away. Fire away. Look at that. Look how clear I was. Bye. Yes.
Thank you very much for a great talk. It was really extraordinary. I had one question about, I guess two questions. One question is like a detailed question. The second question is probably a little bit maybe blasphemous or, I don't know, idolatrous, idolatrous, I don't know, something. But the first question is, could you read that in the first creation, could you read that female figure as Sophia and not?
I.
Because the genitalia on that, on Adam, is clearly not nearly as distinguished as later on. So I just was wondering if you could see even Adam like together in that one in the first creation.
I have actually wrestled that Sophia theory a great deal. And there are two problems with the theory. One is in art, you're usually looking for some kind of precedent, somewhere, anywhere where someone has done this, or also any kind of sermon or any kind of teaching that would have taken place in and around the chapel that Michelangelo would have had contact with, and neither of those things exist. In particular, the image of a Sophia together with the Trinity being present in the person of the Sophia. There's nowhere, and there's a lot of interest in representing the Trinity, but it never ever shows up. And so in that, it becomes very, very difficult to take it into that direction when it makes so much more sense in the context of the space and how the space is used to view it as a link between one another, and also the contact that the female figure has with Adam, looking through God towards Adam and then becoming the link to the child who looks out at you like the Doni Tondo, who has the same figure of the Doni Tondo and then looks out at you. It wouldn't really make sense to put Sophia in that particular position.
My second question was that I know, like in some, well, in the Last Judgment, it's interesting how the circumference of Christ's halo. I mean, Mary is kind of just almost within that, and I'm wondering whether, what we have there
So I think, first of all, the space behind Jesus it's light. It's an image of light. I mean, the halo is, yes, an emanation of light, but Jesus he's represented inside. You know how the other one, the one I was showing you side by side, has its kind of mandorle. It's not the first time we put Mary together with Jesus inside that kind of heavenly globe. I do think she takes a very subordinate position. I mean, she is very, very subordinate to him in the pairing, and so again, I don't know that it puts her quite on par, as if she were one of three persons. Do you see what I mean? Instead of being, she's got very much. It's much more of the co-mediatrix. If we're going to go in that direction, it's much more of a kind of a illustration. If we're going to go in that direction, it's more of a co-mediatrix, but not a Trinitarian vision. Does that make sense? Yep. I have no idea. But I will say that one of the cool things that we always run into in Rome, I think one of the cool things we run into in Rome is the extraordinary amount of images of Eve. I tend to think that's a very interesting thing about Rome. It indicates a fertile ground for Rome in a certain sense for Christianity, because the Romans they consider themselves descendants of the goddess of love. So Julius Caesar and his whole family, who's their goddess? It's not Mars, it's not Jupiter, their goddess is Venus. So they already proclaim themselves, much like the Medicis will later, they proclaim themselves as kind of devotees or descendants of a deity of love. What I think is kind of neat that you're asking me this is today I'm terribly jet lagged. So this is the 14th, so it's the exaltation of the cross, right? So when Helena went to get the cross, when she went to try to find the cross, she went to the Holy Land and she visited the site of Jesus' crucifixion where they had built a temple of Venus. And I was thinking, what an interesting thing that the Romans built a temple of Venus, because again, they're somewhat incomplete and imperfect notion of love. They understand the importance of it, they understand the power of it, but they don't really understand it. And they put it on top of the image of the ultimate love. So I have no problem with thinking that would make perfect sense for C.S. Lewis, who knew plenty of this stuff. But that the Romans really lend themselves to letting Venus be the vanguard, so that the Christians can come behind and explain, okay, I know you all like love, but this is what love really looks like, right? Thank you, that's a cool question. One more, all right, one more. And then you'll have to go to bed because tomorrow you have to go to school. Nothing? Oh, yeah, oh, sorry. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's actually one of the coolest little things. It's one of the very first things that kind of sent me in. There's several things that sent me in this direction. And one of them is that it happens several times. Michelangelo's not the first person to do it by any stretch of the imagination. It shows up quite a bit, but it sets up. It's another major reason to think in terms of the new Eve. It sets up a duel between sin and woman. So if the serpent comes and tempts Mary, and tempts Eve, and by making it this female figure that tempts the female figure, it puts them together in this battle. So afterwards, you will crush the serpent's head, and it will nip at your heels, and so you have Eve and the serpent who face off, and in that particular one, the evil wins. So then Mary will come and she will face off with evil. So again, it gives this amazing idea of almost like these, again, when Perpetua starts thinking of herself as a gladiator, I mean, it gives you the idea of these, like, two women facing off, these two very powerful figures who are facing off, and they happen to be women. So it's actually a kind of, it's usually a strain when you see that, when you see the female figure, it's usually a little flag that you're dealing with a theology that's based on the Immaculate Conception. So yes, it is important, and you did see correctly. And would you like to come take my class?
Thank you, Dr. Lav. Please join me in thanking Dr. Lav for this remarkable evening.